Well, good afternoon. I am Leon Davis. It is Saturday, November the 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time of 2019. And you're listening to Altitude Adjustment. I want to thank you very much for taking the opportunity or taking the time to listen to me this afternoon. This week's podcast is going to be about interracial couples. While I was doing my podcast a couple of weeks ago, I ran across a video of a very educated individual talking about interracial couples, and I wanted to kind of take a look at interracial marriages and couples in general. And so there was two ways I thought to approach it, and one was a macro view, and that's just how society deals with it, how it changes or impacts society. And then there's the micro version, individual a person's experience and how individual couples manage in society as a whole. Now, when I created the graphics for this podcast, I have to explain, and I used a symbol of the male-female, and it was done more out of expedience than to any attempt to negate or marginalize couples, same-sex couples. In creating the graphics that I need, a lot of times I go out and find royalty-free images and free images, and I have to be careful of stepping on someone's copyright or using someone's copyrighted work without their approval or paying them if they're asking for money, or making sure that I give them recognition if that's all that they're asking for. So in this case, the male-female symbol was simply a matter of expedience. It was something that I did not think would be a significant problem as far as copywriting goes, but it wasn't until I was, a couple of hours ago that I realized I did not include same-sex couples in that graphic, and I should have. So I want to make sure that you know that I recognize that. One of the things that I ran across a lot when I was doing my research, and by no means was the research that I did very exhaustive. So there are a lot of probably opportunities to do more and find out more information, but a lot of what I ran across, almost every site that I dealt with as far as interracial couples, talks about attitudes towards interracial dating and interracial marriage, and about how it's become more progressive. And so that's what I want to cover today, and that's coming up right now.
Welcome to Altitude Adjustment.
Okay, so in 1967, the Supreme Court the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, struck down all state laws banning interracial marriage as violations of the Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So interracial dating, now, not all states had bans on interracial dating, but there were enough states that this was an issue that needed to be pushed to the Supreme Court, and it was settled at that time. So most of the data that I have is from 67 this way, towards 2019. I'm going to give you a few facts about that I've run across about interracial marriages. The U.S. population in 1967 was 198.7 million people, and the U.S. population as of 2015 reached 327.2 million people. It was a huge increase, and I mention that because growth in population, if it's fueled mostly by immigration, then the opportunity for interracial couples grows as the number of available partners is impacted by that immigration or by that growth. So if the growth is mostly of one ethnic group, then it may not necessarily impact the growth or fuel any change in the makeup of multiracial couples, and that is an issue because my question is, while there is an increase in interracial couples, does that necessarily equate to an acceptance of race, of people's race? Does that mean that we're becoming more tolerant of each other? That becomes especially significant in our current situation, current political situation, as for the first time that I know of, and it's definitely in my lifetime, we have in the top parts of our political system something that resembles so racism was dealt with in a less direct way previously, where it's more direct in the current administration. And so my question is, though we've increased the number of interracial couples, we don't seem to have become more accepting of one another's differences as far as race goes and ethnicity. And I'm going to address that a little bit more in some of the items that I have coming up. Now, the following is from some of these facts are from the pewsocialtrends.org website. And if you find the podcast someplace, you'll find in the notes a couple of the sites that I used in order to establish, build this case that I'm going to talk about today. In 1967, only 3% of newlywed couples were interracial. In 2015, 17% of newlywed couples were interracial. Now, in 2015, approximately 10% of newly married couples were interracial, and that jumped in 2016 to, I think, 2.2%. From 1980, now, the way things were organized, and one of the things that frustrated me was I didn't have the necessary resources to do as deep a dive into the numbers that I would like to have, and spend as much time on the research to draw out some of the more issues that I had on my mind. And one of the things that I was trying to make sure that I didn't do was have a preconceived notion about what I was going to find, and then look for facts just to justify that. Mostly what I wanted to try to do was get an idea of what information was available. I knew my viewpoint on it and how I arrived at that, but I wanted to try to find information that may help flush out some other ideas about how race has impacted our society. My concern is that while there has been, and I think I mentioned it already, is that while there has been an increase in interracial dating and interracial marriage, there doesn't seem to be an increase in interracial tolerance. And with that being the case, how then does all this matter, and how do we understand it? Some interesting facts that I found too also is that as people get older, they are less likely to be tolerant of interracial couples in their family. So one of the items I got from the Pew site was from 1980 to 2015, the number of recently married blacks in interracial marriages jumped from 5% to 18%. The recently married, also from that same time period, 1880 to 2015, the number of recently married white and interracial marriages, white interracial marriages jumped from 4 to 11%, which was a smaller increase. Also, during that same time period, the number of interracial marriages for Asians declined slightly and remained the same as far as Hispanic newlyweds. Even though interracial marriage has been increasing for those two groups, the Asians and Hispanic, they remain far more likely than black or white newlyweds to marry someone of a different race or ethnicity. About 3 in 10 Asian newlyweds, about 29%, have a spouse of a different race or ethnicity, and the same is true for Hispanics, which at about 27%. As you might guess, as I was anticipated, the higher the educational level, the more likely someone is to marry interracially, especially in the Mexican Latina community and the Asian community. Now, as far as blacks tend to marry interracially more at the lower education level. Education does not seem to impact interracial marriage in the white community, and that kind of surprised me also. These numbers I got from the Census Bureau, and the Census Bureau broke it down by types of interracial relationships, whether it was non-white Hispanic with Hispanic, non-white, pardon me, Hispanic with black, and so forth, in the different categories. And the data here, and I wasn't sure how they broke this data up because they gave it as a block. So in the graphic that I saw, the first was year 2000, and they gave a breakdown of married couples, married interracial couples, and non-interracial couples. Then they went to 2010, and then it jumped as a block from 2012 to 2016. So I don't know if this is, I don't know how to completely interpret this number, but so I'm just going to say that as of 2016, but this number represents from 2012 to 2016. The total number of married couples, now this was just married couples, and I don't think this was just newlyweds. This was total married couples, was 56,781,405 couples. Of that, 50,962,683 or 89.8%, were of the same race and ethnicity. Mixed race couples, 5,818,722, or 10.2%, as I had mentioned earlier. Now, Asian and Hispanic newlyweds are the most likely to be intermarried, and I mentioned that earlier. A growing share of adults say interracial marriage is generally a good thing for American society. And that was the point that I was trying to address, is if we believe that it is a benefit to society, how do we explain our current situation where such diversity is actually shunned on? While we seem to accept interracial relationships more, we don't seem to be accepting the communities that they come from more. So I find an interesting dynamic there. I'm not sure what to make of that. And I wasn't able to find any website or resource that tried to help make sense out of that. How do we get from more accepting of interracial couples, more accepting of interracial relationships, without being more accepting of the communities that they come from? So I've heard several people mention, they have interracial marriages in their family, and that then makes them not prejudiced. And it's hard to reconcile that with how a society functions. So if so many more interracial relationships are occurring, and the attitudes towards interracial relationships are changing, and yet the conditions of minorities in society have worsened, how do we understand that? What is the logic behind that? Why is that happening? Why is that not happening? Why are we still dealing with? You would think if there was an increase in acceptance of interracial relationships, and more people had opportunities to deal with interracial relationships within their own families, that they may then be able to better connect with others in those communities, as while you have to deal with your family member's spouse, there are instances where you are probably going to deal with your family member's spouse's family, and you would. So I would question how that does that breed the ability to build bridges in those cases. So I was reading an article, and this was from the conversation.com, and that link is also in the description. And the title of the article was, "How do Americans really feel about interracial couples?" Now, according to polling data, only a small percentage of people in the U.S., about 9%, say that the rise in interracial relationship or interracial marriage is a bad thing. Again, there's that, more and more people are saying that interracial relationships are acceptable, or they're not as bad, or they're not a bad thing, or they don't have a negative impact on society. So the article goes on, and I'm just going to read a small part of it. It's just a paragraph. Yet our findings indicate that so they did a they did some research, and they ran a poll, and they were trying to identify people's attitudes towards interracial couples. So in the article, they say, yet our findings indicate that most in the U.S. harbor both implicit and explicit biases against interracial couples. Now, these biases were quite robust, showing up among those who had close personal contact with interracial couples, and even some who had once been involved in interracial romantic relationships. The only ones who didn't show biases against the interracial couples were multiracial people. So what they found, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, that even though there were interracial couples in their family, even though they interacted with those couples, even though maybe they had accepted the spouse of another race, their attitudes towards the other race did not seem to change. While their attitude towards interracial dating may have changed, their attitudes towards the other race or other races did not change. And to me, that's extremely significant, as a lot of sites that I mentioned are putting forth this idea that attitudes are changing. Well, attitudes may be changing about a specific event, but they're not changing around how to deal with people in our society who are included in those events. Trying to think of the best way to frame it. Older people become more risk averse, and I get that. As you get older and you have taken your risks in life, and you have built up your wealth, and you have put your life together in a way that is comfortable for you, you're going to be less risk averse. An interracial relationship is probably high risk for a lot of reasons. And I don't want to get into all of those reasons, but a lot of them because you're dealing with a different culture or a different set of values. Even though there are different values within your own ethnic group, people tend to see those as less significant for some reason. That if another person of my ethnic value has, or my ethnic makeup has a different view of life than I do, we can seem to work that out. We can seem to still be come together on that, or at least be acceptable on that. But as far as an interracial relationship or with someone else, people tend to be less flexible on building bridges in order to make life better. So they tend to become more risk averse even in relationships. And one of the things that I noticed in looking around was that a lot of the people who had been in diverse relationships when they were younger were less likely to be accepting of those relationships as they've gotten older. Or maybe even some of them, after getting out of a relationship, they were less likely to get back into another relationship of mixed race. And I don't know. So without having the data and understanding why that decision is made, it's going to be hard to understand how interracial dating has impacted our society. So there is a lot more information that I would like to see available. I don't know if that information is out there. I don't know. I didn't run across it. Understanding, what are the challenges, the day-to-day challenges that people faced in their relationships, and how that impacted their long-term views of other nationalities or other ethnic groups, is going to be important in understanding race in our country. So, the United States, being a supposedly country founded on the idea of, it's not who you are, but we're all in this together, and everyone has an opportunity to try to better themselves. But we still tend to go to our individual corners. I don't know if the current political climate is a direct result of a growing interracial relationships, because we do know that there is a lot of pushback. So when there are advances, there seems to be pushback. And if interracial relationships are on the rise, there may be some pushback by all groups, not just the majority group, but there is some pushback. It is less likely that an educated Black person will marry outside their race. And in understanding why that is, I think is important to understanding race in our country. And if it's important for us to try to move past that and to make it more homogenous, in the sense that we all belong to the same family, that we all belong to the same humanity, and that what we look like does not define how we should be treated. So understanding our ideas as a society around race, and why do we believe that someone of a different race is necessarily unequal to us, and I don't think we try to approach that. And so, to me, it would be interesting if we could find a way to try to at least start asking those questions of ourselves, asking those questions and sharing that information. And just a couple of, just this one. So whites are more willing to date interracially than they are to intermarry or bear multiracial children. And I didn't say that to single out whites as a problem. I'm not looking at this as a problem. I'm looking at it as an opportunity to try to build something. If we identified some of the things that we have to deal with in society, we can then start to ask questions about, or relevant questions about, why these things are happening, understanding why people are behaving the way that they are. Why do they feel, why do they identify with certain ideas and ideologies over others? So I read an article. I'm constantly looking through the news. I think it's a great form of information. And this was a CNN article, and I'll try to remember where I put the link in the description. And the article was about a young lady in her 20s, and she believed herself to be liberal. And from the time she first was introduced to, she met a guy who was part of the alt-right, and she said from the time he introduced himself and through 6 months, within a 6-month time period, she was actually planning rallies, helping to indoctrinate others, and trying to understand where she was at the time, why she believed she was liberal, why did she accept that teaching, why did she live in that world, is a important part of trying to understand human behavior and maybe find a solution to hate and anger. Okay, so but it was a very interesting article. I'm definitely going to try to put that in the description. Make sure that if you get a chance, you look for that article. I said it was on CNN, and I think it was printed yesterday or day before yesterday, maybe the last couple of days. If I'm not able to run across that article again, I'll have to go back to my history. So one of the things, I'm going to make this the last thing, and then I'm going to get out of here. There was so Facebook is, if you go to, they got a Facebook view, and there was this, it's about a 30-minute show, and it appears to be independently produced, but it's very well done. The way it's shot is seems very professional. It's very organized. It's very good and very interesting, and it's called "Sorry for Your Loss." There were 2 seasons out there. I've gotten through half of the first season. I don't spend a lot of time watching video other than news, but it seemed like a very interesting podcast or show, and it was a white woman married to a black man who died, and it goes through her grief, but it's more than that, and there's more to the story, as there is a multiracial family involved, other than the one that she's married to. And so again, it's Sorry for Your Loss. If you get an opportunity to look for it on Facebook, check it out and let me know what you think of it. I'm going to wrap up. I'll be back in a couple of weeks, and I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join me this afternoon. This concludes this episode of the podcast. The video podcast is available on YouTube. All you need to do is do a search for Lions Den STL. Now, the audio podcast is available. The video podcast is also available on Periscope.tv. Now, the audio podcast is available on Stitcher.com, Anchor.fm, the iTunes Store, the Google Music Play Store, and almost any place that you look for your audio podcast. Please consider supporting this podcast by visiting the anchor.fm/altitude-adjustment2. The internet is powered by your likes, shares, and comments. Please like, share, and comment on this and other episodes where you find them, because it matters. As always, be cool, be calm, and above all, be careful. Look out for the other guy, because they may not be looking out for you.